Good afternoon. Glad to be here in Port Angeles, Washington. Still a timber-dependent community made so by the terrain, the climate, the forest, and the people. Some months ago, it occurred to me that the public really has not been informed about what's been going on in the national forests since a change in management style began about 20 years ago. This land use decision was reached really without understanding the ramifications. They are clear and undeniable now, and in my view, severe and unjustified. A place to start is with the 132,000 acre ranger district, in this case the Solduck, just west of Port Angeles, which is a microcosm of national forests throughout the West, and to use photographs to describe the impacts. Prior to 20 years ago, the Forest Service was committed to managing these public properties under the philosophy of the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. In other words, multiple use. The policy provided access to the public for all sorts of activities and was widely accepted. Funding came primarily from the harvest of timber on a perpetual, sustainable basis. These funds were also used to support the area's schools and roads by allocating 25% of the receipts for that purpose. The balance was deposited in the federal treasury. These federal lands, when established as the national forests, helped replace their alternative value if they had been placed in private lands and taxed. However, over time, mainly as the result of preservationists utilizing the courts, the original purpose of the Forest Service has been compromised. Now the forests are primarily managed as ecological reserves, much in the nature of national parks, but without the associated funding and status of such a designation. In this presentation, I plan to show that current Forest Service policies have led to serious land management problems on the ground. A series of slides was developed to show the present state of management on this one ranger district, which is roughly the size of an area between Port Angeles and Sequim and the mountains and the Straits of Juan de Fuca. It may surprise you or disturb you as it did me, but you be the judge. So let's get started. The first thing we did was get into an airplane and fly over the district. I was accompanied by Pam Russell, a graphic artist who did the aerial pictures, and Stan Fouts, a forest engineer who had been with the district many years, now retired, but still very active on forest issues. He did the map reading from the back seat. At one stage, his stomach did a backflip, but he endured to the end anyway. Now we'll get into the slides. This first series shows the generation of slide activity from unmaintained road systems. Culverts and ditches fill up, and this is the result. The snow in this photo accentuates the problem, which is also noticeable on the distant ridge. From the air, we also notice the incidence of blowdown. This would be expected, particularly where access is cut off by slides or abandoned road systems. In other words, the timber is unavailable through lack of access. And then we saw a number of abandoned roads where alder, like this, often seeds in and prevents maintenance or other management options. After the flight, we decided to drive in and have a closer look at the failures we had seen. Stan's expertise with his camera, as well as his knowledge of the district, have been extremely valuable in presenting this program. In fact, it wouldn't have happened without him. In many cases, we tried to ascertain the cause. In this case, you can tell this road has become a ditch, and plugged ditch lines lead to uncontrolled water events like this, and in many cases to the slides we had seen. In some instances, we found that the Forest Service planned on repair, and this failure at 8.3 miles on the South Fork Solduck's main road system, known as the main line in the trade, has been fixed. The makeshift bridge that you see there was made by hunters for access. These next two pictures, this is the first, show the extent of the damage at this location at 8.3 miles. When a fill like this fails due to lack of maintenance, there is a significant amount of sediment deposited in fish habitat. However, no plans address 3 more failures in the next mile of this mainline road. This is the first one. This is the second. And this is the third. So fixing the fill at 8.3 miles is a beginning, but it has taken at least 3 years to find the necessary funds to fix this one failure, the first one we looked at with the culvert. Meanwhile, the rest of the road beyond that continues to deteriorate. Recently, at a meeting with the Department of Natural Resources that manages the state of Washington's forests, the forester in charge said that on 2,300 miles of roads on the Olympic District, no significant failures occurred in last December's huge rain and windstorm. The contrast with roads on federal lands is significant, proving that well-maintained roads are the key to reducing sedimentation. Then some Forest Service roads were blacktopped to reduce the hauling costs. This was quite expensive, but the investment is gradually being lost in many locations due to a lack of maintenance. The blacktop in this section won't last long. In fact, you wouldn't want to drive over that section. Then we even saw signs like this in Bear Creek, a blacktop road, advising the public not to use them, as excessive speed on failing road surfaces is a safety issue. You can also travel on many of the mainline roads like this one at Bachman Creek, but as you can see, a chainsaw is almost a requirement if you plan to get very far. In fact, in 2 solid days of driving on the district, we never met another car. People have obviously lost faith about accessibility, so public use has fallen off. And we found some things we didn't understand, like this perfectly good pipe being replaced on Bear Creek. This is the inlet to that pipe. And I'll show you the outlet. That's the outlet. No problem with fish passage in that installation. Both look fine for fish passage, but a bottomless culvert has been installed. This has been installed since those first pictures I showed you, but I'm sure at a cost estimated to be $150,000 for one crossing. Perhaps the most shocking discovery was to find that the East Twin Road, which is a mainline link between Highway 112 and Highway 101, was completely obliterated for 8 miles. The fills have been removed, like the one behind me there. And the grade has even been replanted so that no further travel is planned. I am constantly amazed by the ingenuity and work ethic of loggers. This is a skyline unit in the Sitcom River where logs were flown over a half mile, 3,000 feet, to the Sitka main line, which is where the truck is parked. And as you can see, on the far hillside, the reproduction is well underway. However, under current plans, the plantation and the adjacent timber will not be managed or logged. Now this shows what is being done now by the Forest Service. The logging being done is mostly thinning in young stands like this. The corridor you see is the skyline corridor, and the trees on each side were the ones that were left from the thinning. The purpose is to accelerate growth on the remaining trees so that they reach a large size sooner and to be left to become old growth. The term is called late successional reserve. Now this shows the advantages of thinning. On the left is the thin stand, in this case on DNR land, and on the right, unthinned stand. That happens to be a property line. The sunlight allows herbaceous growth used by wildlife, whereas the unthinned stands are too dense for sunlight to reach the forest floor. Through lack of access, in the case of the Forest Service, many of these unthinned stands will not be managed. Often people object to the practice of clear cutting due to its initial unattractive appearance. Even so, Even-aged management of timber on the west side of the Cascades has many benefits, one of which is wildlife. These elk are grazing in a private clear-cut next to the national forest. If you travel the back country, this is where you are most likely to see these magnificent animals as they are feeding. Now that clear-cutting has declined significantly on the national forests, you can be sure of a negative impact on many species of wildlife. My dog decided she would challenge the lead elk in this photo until he turned in her direction, and then she set a speed record back to the truck. So far, many roads have not been obliterated or lost from lack of maintenance, and that's good. Some old-growth stands are still accessible and could be saved should a fire or other damage occur. However, the longer the roads are allowed to disintegrate, the more at risk these old trees become. Snags standing on side hills like this are torches in the wind. The 1951 Forks fire of about 30,000 acres carried by snags such as these blew up and traveled 20 miles in 8 hours. Obviously, the adjacent reproduction established at public expense will also burn. Can you imagine trying to get these burning snags on the ground without access? Then we found a large stand near the Snyder Work Center, totaling about 800 acres that is dying. This was planted by the CCCs in the 1930s. The seedlings that were planted were inappropriate for the site. There was a mistake made. But rather than harvest the trees before they began to deteriorate, they are now becoming a fire hazard. This is a view of the Goodman Creek drainage. Goodman Creek flows into the South Fork of the Solduck, a large river. The young trees are well stocked, as you can see, ready for management, and are surrounded by old-growth trees which continue to age. Since the 5 miles of road serving this drainage has been destroyed, very little, if any, management can take place. Trees blow down. There are many examples of blow-down patches, such as this, about a mile up Bear Creek on the forest boundary. There is very little evidence of an active salvage program on this forest. Now, this stand on the Cooper Ranch Road had been thinned, and later part of it blew down in the December 06 windstorm. It's now been sold and is partially logged, which is encouraging. But from what we have seen, it is the exception rather than the rule. Blowdown must be picked up rapidly to avoid sap rot and the damage by insects such as ambrosia beetles. You can imagine the amount of blowdown from last December's huge storm. Values change, as in the case of alder this past year where the demand is strong. This is alder on Forest Service land. And also on this photo, the light color shows the extent of alder stands near Bear Creek. It's extensive. The wood is used for furniture, and we have a brand new sawmill here in Port Angeles with a healthy appetite for this wood. Yet I know of no plans that make Forest Service alder available to this strong market and to retain valuable jobs. So briefly, this visual tour should give you some idea of what current land management practices are doing or not doing, as the case may be. If it's continued, the present course assures much of the same. And to some folks, that's just fine. The national forests, after all, are for all of the people and must be protected. But is that notion realistic? Not managing the national forests is not protecting them. The pictures you have seen are not contrived or misrepresented in any way. The damage you have seen will continue unabated, and the forests are at great risk from cataclysmic events such as fire, wind, insect infestations, and disease. Let me show you a few final pictures. This was taken near the top of Fairholme Hill. Contrary to what you may think, this is not in the National Forest. This is in the National Park, which was acquired. This picture shows the second growth forest that, when acquired by the park, was a very large clear cut. The logging had occurred in the late 40s and early 50s. In fact, Stan Fouts' father, Slim Fouts, worked there as a faller and a choker setter. it regenerated naturally, a diverse stand that someday will mirror what stood there before the initial logging. The next picture is the site of a blowdown in the park from the 1962 Columbus Day blowdown, which blew down about 3 million feet on 60 acres, or about 750 truckloads. I went on the field trip with the superintendent and a bunch of loggers as well. His name was John Dorr. He decided that the fire hazard created by this blowdown was so risky for the park that he chose to harvest the timber. His decision was right then. It would be right now. As you can see, this is a healthy 40-year-old forest created by logging. Not all of the trees blew down, and the ones left standing, such as this one, help provide a seed source for the new forest. The reality of using good judgment in the National Forest System is unacceptable by preservationists, and nearly every attempt at harvesting blowdown, fire-killed, or disease-infested timber is stopped in its tracks by court action. This is what has happened in the national forests. Suppose you have a business with a stream of income. You decide you want to change the direction of your business, so you cut off the income source and try to live on donations. Is this a recipe for success? As we know, these annual donations by Congress have stopped this year. Should courts manage the national forests, or should it be agencies charged with the responsibility with qualified people? Should we place the remaining unroaded portions of the national forests, amounting to 58 million acres, that's 58 times the size of the national park right here, in a large unfunded preserve, as proposed by our own Senator Cantwell and Representative Inslee? Should we allow the road system we have bought and paid for to disintegrate so that currently accessible acres become inaccessible? Should we make certain that inaccessibility ensures that catastrophic events deny the salvage of merchantable trees and preclude other management activities? By letting the Forest Service timber become inaccessible, are we precluding the use of it as biofuel once the technology is perfected? And it's being worked on right now. The only answer, I believe, is a modest timber program that would provide some of the benefits lost. It might not resemble the programs of the past. I can envision an active salvage program, smaller clear-cut sizes, the wider use of natural regeneration, a wider diversity perhaps in the plantations, a longer rotation than in the past, but a steady harvest, and a road maintenance plan that would protect the infrastructure that still exists and provide public access, to name just a few ideas. It would, however, be something you could rely on year in and year out. Now we have unfunded chaos in the national forests. It's no way to manage land. The photographs we have helped identify the enormity of the problem. The Soldic is an example, but you can be certain the same issues prevail in every ranger district in the West. It is not time to blame anybody. It's time to roll up our sleeves and design something that is fiscally responsible, environmentally sensitive, and provides the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. Do I expect this to happen? Of course not. As a people, we have permitted a public policy change to throw thousands of people out of work. A friend of mine in Eugene, Oregon, keeps an accurate record of these losses. At last count for the 5-state area of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, California, and Montana, it was over 30,000 primary jobs during this period. If you add loggers and suppliers and the ripple effect of these jobs, you can easily estimate the loss of 100,000 jobs. The policy has destroyed businesses, disrupted institutions, including counties and school districts, destroyed infrastructure, caused damage to our environment, which you have clearly seen in these photographs, and threatens much more of the same. So how are we going to initiate a change that will correct these things? Where would the energy or leadership come for this? Until you realize you are on the wrong road, you are unlikely to go back. And that's been my purpose, to define that moment. You, as the stockholders, need to know. Initially, I thought of a name for this: the inconvenient truth. but unfortunately that had already been taken. Even so, there is much truth to what has been presented, and sadly, it is also inconvenient. Thank you for listening.